the shadow world of Orban, family, business, and corruption. In this investigation, we delve into one of the hottest topics in modern Hungary, corruption, which has its roots at the very top of power. And of course, at the center of this scheme is Prime Minister Viktor Orban. It would seem that he promises to fight corruption, but in reality, it is his family and closest associates who are getting richer with public funds, and the country itself is drowning in state tenders, which are won only with the help of political connections. How did Orban, a fighter for national interests, actually turn Hungary into his private property? Viktor Orban has been Hungary's prime minister for more than 15 years. During that time, he has earned a reputation as a defender of national interests and a man who speaks out against globalism and the EU's corrupt elites. He has repeatedly criticized Brussels for trying to interfere in Hungarian affairs, and his speeches against transparency and EU reforms have become a real flagship of his political career. But the reality has turned out to be quite different. At first glance, Orban's 2025 declaration looks modest. He and his wife claim to have only 14,000 euros in their bank account and own just 2 houses. But is that true? Orban continues to live in a luxurious mini Versailles, an old Austro-Hungarian castle owned by his father, Győző Orban. The castle was purchased for 15 million euros, and another 30 million euros was spent on its restoration. And so the question is, where did Orban get all that money? How can the Hungarian Prime Minister, who only declares his wealth of 14,000 euros, afford such luxury? This is just one of many mysteries in Orban's financial history. It seems that more and more facts point to possible corruption schemes serving the personal interests of the Prime Minister and his family. Back in 2010, the Prime Minister's wife, Anikó Lévai, declared as many as 38 real estate properties. Among them are a family home in Budapest, 14 plots of land in the city of Szolnok, agricultural land and vineyards, a real kingdom. And this is only officially.
Viktor Orban himself. He spent years struggling on his modest income, declaring minimal assets. But behind this screen lies the truth. Back in 2005, he owned 52 hectares of land, though registered to his wife, all to avoid awkward questions and taxes. I would like to mention the elite wine-growing region of Tokaj, where Anikó Lévai was a co-owner of the winemaking company Szarhégi Dúló Szarasadani Tokaj Hegyalja Kft. And when the scandal surrounding family assets began to gain momentum, the property was quietly transferred to his daughter, Rachel Orban.
In 2023, through a trust company, she purchased 34 hectares of vineyards that previously belonged to her mother. In the town of Bicca, Anikó Lévai shares land with her business partner, János Flyer, a family that leases 377 hectares of state-owned land in Felcsit, a figure 10 times higher than the national average. And while ordinary Hungarians count every forint, the Prime Minister's family is multiplying its assets in the shadows.
In the case of the vineyards in Tokaj, everything is obvious. The state's right to priority land acquisition is being abolished, and suddenly the land passes into the hands of the Prime Minister's daughter. Fair competition? Open deal? No. This is a classic example of how state power is used for personal interests. When the law works not for the people but for the ruling family, it is no longer just corruption. This is the transformation of the country into private property.
However, an even more worrying point is Orban's close ties with his son-in-law, István Tiborcs. It is through him that Orban can direct huge amounts of public funds to his own projects. István Tiborcs is not just the Prime Minister's son-in-law, but also a key figure who controls several large companies that receive state contracts. His company, BDPST Group, and Elios Innovative ZRT, which he heads, have amassed huge fortunes thanks to direct ties to Orban's government. The Dorothea Hotel in the heart of Budapest is just one of the many projects that his companies are involved in. This luxurious 5-star hotel, part of the international Marriott chain, cost over 300 million euros. And that's not all. Through his company, Tiborcs owns a whole package of historic buildings in the capital, most of which were acquired through fraudulent tenders. State money was used to restore these buildings, which then fell into the private hands of the Orban family. But it is not only in Budapest that Tiborcs feels his impunity. His elite residence in the Szabadság district, one of the most expensive in Budapest. This is another symbol of how the Orban family, using state funds, is becoming oligarchs. At a time when most Hungarians are facing problems, the Orban family is increasing its wealth. And all this at the expense of abuses that are firmly rooted in the political corruption mechanism. Tibor also owns large plots of land, estates and wineries, and these assets are not limited to Hungary. In Spain, in the luxury resort of Marbella, he was seen driving his own Ferrari SF90 Spider, worth about 600,000 euros. Tibor claims that this car was rented, but the question of the origin of the funds for such expenses remains unanswered. Moreover, there are suggestions that the Orban family may own luxury real estate in Spain, which was purchased with funds illegally obtained through state tenders. In Romania, Granite Asset Management, owned by Tibor, acquired the Equilibrium 1 office building. This is just one example of how the Orban family is expanding its corrupt connections beyond Hungary. It appears that public funds that should be used to improve the lives of ordinary Hungarians are instead being used to expand the private empires of Orban's son-in-law and his family. This is corruption at the highest level, when what is at stake is not just political power, but billions in profits obtained through people's poverty. Also, Orban's ties with the international criminal Putin are putting democratic countries of the European Union at risk with shadowy corruption schemes. During the events of the annexation of Crimea in Ukraine in 2014, Orban became one of the first European leaders to block the imposition of sanctions on Russia. Already in 2020, Orban began to enrich himself by signing an agreement to build new nuclear reactors in cooperation with Russia. These deals brought him not only political dividends, but also financial ones, thanks to large state contracts with Russian companies such as Rosatom.
In 2020, Viktor Orban effectively sold part of Hungary's energy independence to Moscow. Without any tender, bypassing European rules, his government signed an agreement with Russia's Rosatom to build new reactors for the Pac's nuclear power plant for a whopping 12.5 billion euros. And what's worse, the project was financed through a loan from Russia, driving the country into debt dependence on Putin. Back then, we sounded the alarm and spoke openly about the risks of corruption, about the strengthening of Russian influence in Hungary. But this did not stop Orban. He chose Moscow over transparency. He chose his own benefit over national interests. And today we see how this destructive policy is costing ordinary Hungarians, as well as those in opposition to him.
Orban's ties to Russia are part of a corruption machine that works for the benefit of private individuals, not for the benefit of the Hungarian people. Hungarian companies linked to Orban's government have won contracts for the construction and renovation of important facilities, with partial financing coming from Russia. This is a classic example of how public funds are used to enrich individuals rather than to develop the country. Another tool was OTP Bank, the largest commercial bank in Hungary. Despite EU sanctions, in 2024, OTP Bank increased its net profit in the Russian Federation by 40% to $372 million. This looks absurd against the background of the European policy of isolating the Kremlin, but it is quite logical in the context of Orban's agreements with Moscow. OTP Bank actively serves the Russian military, offering them preferential loans, and also opens accounts for key enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex. Among the bank's clients are manufacturers of components for drones, pontoon bridges for the army, and even suppliers of isotopes for nuclear weapons, such as Okskaya Shipyard, Volna Plant, ASM Service. Thus, in 2023, the company Danube Agrotech Kft. Was registered in Hungary, which received a payment of 3.2 million euros from the Russian counterparty Technopromexport. Formally, the agreement concerned the supply of veterinary drugs, but under this code, microchips and sensors intended for Russian drones of the Orlan type were actually transferred. In addition, in January 2024, law enforcement officers detained a container with sensors and cables used in the same drones in the port of Constanta in Romania.
The military cargo was transported together with pharmaceutical goods, which according to the transport documents belonged to Gideon Richter and Aegis Pharmaceuticals. All this indicates the creation of special financial channels to circumvent sanctions under the guise of pharmaceutical trade, which actually financed the purchase of dual-use equipment for the Russian army. The family receives up to 75% of the net profit from these transactions, which is tens of millions of euros, which are transferred to fictitiously created companies controlled by István Tiborek. Hungarian companies associated with the Orban family earn incredible amounts of money from these schemes, which are deposited in the offshore accounts of the Orban family.
Orban's family doesn't just live in luxury. They have built an entire corruption empire, where public funds go to their own projects. Orban and his inner circle control a vast array of businesses that thrive on government contracts and corruption schemes. Tibor, his son-in-law, has become a major player in these schemes, and Orban himself demonstrates how to cheat and circumvent the law at the highest level. This is not just corruption. It is a systemic problem that is rooted in the very structure of Hungarian power. Orban not only continues to enrich his family, but also convinces the world that this is his fight for the national interest, and it seems that this fight continues only to further consolidate his power and control the country. Despite numerous investigations, international sanctions and criticism from the EU, Orban and his family have escaped punishment. But how much longer will this corrupt reign last? This is a question that we will probably only get an answer to when corruption schemes stop bringing dividends, and the moment comes when law enforcement agencies pay attention to all these actions. Let's also take a closer look at what Viktor Orban is doing right now. What is his priority in political activity? Instead of improving the financial stability, education, and healthcare in his country, Viktor Orban is organizing a fictitious referendum to block Ukraine's accession to the EU. EU officials emphasize that such actions undermine the unity of the European Union and contradict the general position of support for Ukraine. Perhaps Prime Minister Orban should focus on things that will enrich every citizen of Hungary. We continue to monitor the corruption schemes and political activities of Viktor Orban and his scandalous family. We will reveal more shocking facts in the following videos. To be continued.